I'm gonna record this, start recording the meeting. Okay, so ready?
Sure.
Uh, so what are your experiences with systemic racism and how has it affected your life?
Okay, so as a Black person, I've had many experiences of systemic racism from when I was a child, right? So, for an example, the public schools in my neighborhood, which was predominantly Black and Latino, were underfunded, while the public schools in neighborhoods nearby had a lot more resources and were predominantly for uh, white children and middle class children. New York City has some of the most segregated public schools in the entire nation. Um, and then also in my neighborhood, many of the houses there were abandoned when I was growing up. And much of the real estate was empty lots filled with garbage, trash, and rats. And over time, my neighborhood gentrified and things have changed. But many of those residents, including me, um, ended up not being able to afford those changes and being ended up being pushed out of the neighborhood as it got better in certain situations. And as a young adult, I was very responsible and saved up to buy my first condo. But despite having a stable job and an excellent credit score, I could not find a mortgage loan anywhere. Finally, I found there was a Black bank, a Black owned bank that lent to me, but I had to pay more for that mortgage. The rate was higher, and I had to pay an insurance fee on top of the actual loan. But I was just actually really happy to even get a loan in the first place. Um, so, you know, um, I've given you an example of like how I've, been disadvantaged by systemic racism, like in the sense of education and real estate. But I could also tell you about ways that I've been a disadvantage because of my race and healthcare or employment. But the point is, it's not just a story. It's not just my story. It's the patterns of stories like by other people like me. So many similar stories from many people who are disadvantaged because of their race, by the many structures and institutions that are supposed to help them, that do help white people. Um, so, for example, I had a friend who was not Black tell me that she was able to secure a mortgage without any problem, and her credit score was way worse than mine. And although that's an anecdote, there are plenty of research studies that show how rampant discrimination is and how it happens across the board with buying a house, finding a job, getting paid your value, getting a good education, getting good health care. And the fact that it occurs across so many different connected structures, that's what makes it systemic. And then the fact that it particularly happens to Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color makes it right makes it racism.
Okay. Uh, okay. So, um, recently, like, um, systemic racism has like surfaced up more in modern days. So, uh, why do you think that is starting to happen now rather than like a couple years earlier?
So systemic racism has always existed. Um, it's always been a problem. Um, I think that it just might be that really only marginalized people could feel it or could see it, right? So now with the internet and how quickly ideas can travel from groups of people, social media has been able to bring systemic racism to the attention of many white or otherwise privileged people in America who didn't need to think about it or have to care about it. In fact, you know, historians believe that during the civil rights movement, it was the introduction of television that allowed the public to see, to witness how terribly police and the government were treating Black people with fire hoses and dogs and literally bloodying them up just because they sat at a lunch counter or in front of a bus. These were acts of protest that people did to showcase the systemic racism that they faced. And people seeing them on TV, people seeing this act on TV made it more real, uh, made it in your face. And so similarly, in today's time, social media allows us to hear the experiences of masses of people. And you can't pretend that this isn't a huge ubiquitous problem just because it doesn't affect you, although some people still do.
Hmm. So at the first question, I know you talked a bit about this, but like, what does systemic racism mean to you, or like, what do you take it as?
So, what does systemic racism mean to me? Systemic racism is a real thing that exists. It's like air or wind, right? You can't touch it, it's not tangible, but you can feel its effects. And I say this because it's not about what it means to me, it is about what it is. It's real. Whether you feel the wind or not, air is a real thing. And many Black people in America feel the effects of that wind, and many white people do not. But I want to give you like a real, like actual definition of systemic racism. Because when you can't see or touch something, it can be very hard to understand, particularly when you don't feel its negative effects. Systemic racism is a system of structures, policies, and culture that disadvantages people of particular races or ethnicities while benefiting others. In the United States, systemic racism disadvantages people of color, particularly Black people and Native Indigenous people, because of the legacy of American slavery and the genocide of Native Americans in the US. Those legacies have been coded into laws and practices that sit at the foundation of many of our governmental institutions. And it has hurt and continued to harm Black, Indigenous people, and people of color. And conversely, sometimes helped white people and people with proximity to whiteness. Systemic racism is the way, like it's the how, the means for which white supremacy is reinforced in America generation after generation.
Uh, okay, so what do you think like began systemic racism? What do you think like started it?
So I mentioned the term white supremacy. So when you ask me what do you think began systemic racism, the notion that white people are superior and Black people are inferior, and all other races and ethnicities of people are somewhere in between that dichotomy based on their proximity to either whiteness or Blackness, which could be because of the color of their skin, because of their cultural practices, because of their residential geography, like where they live. This is what seeds systemic racism. This notion of white superiority and Black inferiority has been coded into laws and policies and American culture. And it took shape, various forms over the years, from slavery to Jim Crow to prison system to police brutality. But it is the idea of white supremacy that began systemic racism and continues to fuel it.
Um, okay, so like, uh, do you, over time, like systemic racism, like, has you said it was like a thing over like many years. Do you think like from your childhood, systemic racism has improved?
Um, so do I think that systemic racism has improved since my childhood? I can't give you a simple answer here, right? It's really tough, right? But your qualifier of since your childhood is very important, right? Because how you feel, how a person feel like the effects, the wind of systemic racism depends on, during a storm, whether your house is kind of made of straws or bricks. So this is a metaphor that I'm using, right? And so since my childhood, which has changed for me is my class status. So now as an adult, I am better protected from systemic racism than when I was a child. I still experience it, but there are ways that I can try to work around it. There are resources I can tap into because of my middle class status. Many others aren't that lucky. And so class matters when we talk about the effects of systemic racism. So does gender, right? So I am able to weather systemic racism differently from someone that doesn't have degrees from elite institutions or who isn't middle class. But I conversely, I may also not be able to weather the effects of systemic racism than a cisgender man because patriarchy helps him. And so this is a very personal and nuanced answer, right? It depends on who you are. But I can answer this question in another way, in a more general kind of sense. And so then that question would be, has systemic racism improved just in general for Black people, Indigenous people, people of color? And for that, we have to look at the data. Let's look at the data. Um, and so for me, I'll talk about Black people because I am one. And in, but so when you think about like so many aspects, like the wealth gap and the education gaps, there are these huge gaps that exist between white people and Black people in outcomes. Let's just talk, for instance, about health, right? Black women die at higher rates while giving birth than white women. Black babies die more, um, particularly when their doctors are white. Black men have the lowest mortality rates. The health gaps between Black and white people in America are tragic, and it's killing us. And so I could talk more about the health gaps, but I could also talk more about the gaps in education and in criminal mortality rates. In criminal justice, and in labor and employment. And so if we go back to like the definition of systemic racism, a system of structures that disadvantage Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, and some of those structures and for some of those groups, the gaps have narrowed since my childhood. And others, it had stayed the same, but in still some others, it has widened. And so what does all of that add up to for the entire system? What does all of that add up to? And I would say not enough. The answer to the question, do I think systemic racism has improved, is no, not enough, not meaningfully enough.
Oh, okay. So, as a sociologist, like a lot of like through the civil rights movement and stuff, I think that like a lot of people are like trying to make things more diverse. So, as a sociologist, what do you think like causes systemic racism and keeps it like a prominent issue in society?
So, what I mentioned earlier about the notion of white supremacy, um, of, in my opinion, being what started systemic racism, that same thing that began it, caught, causes it, right? This sick really just stupid and vain idea that a particular race of people is better than everyone else, along with the dehumanizing and evil notion that other races of people, particularly Black people, are inferior and not even human, is what causes systemic racism. I mean, Black people were property at one point in America. They were branded with branding irons. They were breeded like animals. They were shot, and that was then. But even today, they're shot while they're sleeping in their bed, doing nothing, just living. And so this notion, this belief of Black people as less than, is what causes systemic racism. But you specifically asked me, like, as a sociologist, and there's a lot of different ways to try to look at this complex system fueled by this inane and simple-minded racist idea of white supremacy. And so when I was in graduate school, while I was studying this, I focused my studies on race and ethnicity, and on organizations. And I was particularly interested in how organizations and institutions and the actors that are within them are able to affect the outcomes being of people being served by those organizations. And so people experience life, they experience America, they experience democracy and the government through organizations. And I believe organizations and the people who are within them and they lead them have a role in reinforcing or dismantling systemic racism. But unfortunately, many of the people leading organizations that can help dismantle racism are not Black, are not people of color, are not indigenous, and or they don't see systemic racism as an urgent, real problem. And that makes a difference. Um, so so it makes a difference because if you're not fighting against systemic racism, then you're helping it. You're part of the problem. Um, and so what continues to cause racism is us not addressing it.
Uh, so just now you just were talking about like addressing like you have to address systemic racism. Are there any like clear way, like solutions to it, or is there anything like specific people should do?
Yes, there are ways to solve it, and people have been and are continuing to chip away at systemic racism bit by bit, right? It's through all of our structures, right? It's a system of structures. And if you think about it, it's like a rowboat with a hole in it, right? So even as people try to take out the water, if they stop or slow down, the boat will sink. And if that hole gets bigger, the boat will sink. And if they try to take out all of that water with only a teaspoon instead of a big pail, the boat would sink. And if some people on the boat keep others from trying to take out that water, or they don't help to take out the water, the boat will sink. And so, in this metaphor, the water is systemic racism. And it's typically those most impacted, um, most likely to get drowned, who are trying to get the water out. So people at the front lines of change, right? Like when you think about the Black Panthers, like the Black Panthers Party, or just even regular people that made up the movements of the civil rights movement, or these days, the Black Lives Matter movement. The issue is that we can spend forever trying to get the water out while more water comes in. And what everyone needs to do is help patch up the hole in the boat. And you do that by fixing the laws and enforcing them. You need everyone to do that. You need to pass laws to ensure the water stops flooding us, that people are allowed, that Black people, people of color, Indigenous people are allowed to be discriminated against. Um, and so John Lewis, a great civil rights activist who died in 2020, left us with these words about democracy is an act. We must act by joining protests, by educating ourselves, our families, our friends, by civically participating in our local community, through voting, going to school board meetings, calling your official offices when they're not doing right. There are many different ways to act. You just have to find the one that works for you and do it, but you must act.
Okay. So, uh, what groups of people are affected by systemic racism and why?
So, in the United States, the people most affected by systemic racism are Black and Indigenous people, primarily because they're dealing with the legacies of slavery and genocide. Um, and within these groups of people, poor Black and Indigenous people are even more impacted because, like I mentioned before, they have less resources to weather the storm of systemic racism. And then you could even think about poor Black and Indigenous women who are also impacted because they have to deal with the impacts of patriarchy and sexism that is also very, very entangled with white supremacy culture. And so I've been kind of narrowing the lens in, but if we zoom out a little bit, other people of color um, and non-white people are affected by structural racism and racial discrimination. So, for example, Japanese Americans had to deal with it when they were relocated in internment camps, and their property and things were taken away from them by their own government. And Muslim Americans, after the World Trade Center bombings, they had to deal with police surveillance, arrest, and flight bans that ensued because of it. Latinos and Latinas deal with structural racism as well, particularly around immigration and the horrifying separation of children from their families that's been occurring. Um, so many people of color experience systemic racism. But when we look at the constant target of systemic racism over the history of America, Black and Indigenous people, particularly those who are poor and women, are the most affected.
Okay. Well, that ends the list of questions that we created. Is there anything else you want to say about the topic of systemic racism in America?
No, I mean, I'm happy that you asked me to do this interview, and I'm really glad that you are seriously thinking and contemplating what systemic racism is. And I hope this helps you think about what you're going to do to help fight it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank
Uh, oh wait. Can you just like say your name and then like your your degree because we forgot to do that in the introduction.
you. Sure. So I'm Dr. Asha M. Abdil, and I have a PhD in sociology with a concentration in organizational studies, as well as race and ethnicity.
Okay, thank you. Well, that concludes the interview.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to end the Zoom meeting. Okay, bye.